newscasters sit here.
I always wonder what they talk about.
Sweet.
I think the new thing is not just like who has what t-shirt, but
I think we're going. We're live. All
This
right.
always happens. I end up like, then the conversation starts and you start saying, okay, we're live. Hey, it's Alex Williams here of the New Stack here for day 2 of KubeCon plus CloudNativeCon. This is the KubeCon day, and we're here to talk about the future of Kubernetes. And wondering if you guys could just introduce yourselves and we'll just get started in the discussion.
Hi, yeah, my name's Phil Whitrock. I work at Google, and I'm focused on the CLI and tools.
Hi, my name is Aparna Sinha. I work with Phil Whitrock at Google, and I lead product management for Google Kubernetes Engine, genius, and also for the open source Kubernetes project.
Hi, Alex. Hi, everybody. My name is Aaron Kirkenberger. I work for Samsung SDS as their community evangelist. Currently co-lead of the special interest group around testing for Kubernetes. I participate actively in the contributor experience special interest group, the scalability special interest group, and I recently got elected to the steering committee.
In fact, I have 2 people, both of them on the
I too got elected to the steering committee.
So what is, so tell us what is the steering committee, because it's relatively new, isn't it? And what is this role?
So I think that Kubernetes as a project is kind of going through its adolescence, and as we go through growing pains, we occasionally need to have like a decision maker or a decider, right? Except since the Kubernetes community is kind of all about openness and transparency, and trying to sort of hand control of the project over to the community, instead of having a benevolent dictator for life type of role, we'd rather have that role shared amongst a committee of people. And so what we initially did was take the 7 people who sort of were most knowledgeable about the project and were there from its inception, and so kind of have the cultural values and identity of Kubernetes. And they sort of laid out a charter. We then elected 6 additional members from the community who are active contributors, such as Phil and myself. And our job is basically to try as hard as possible not to be the bottleneck on making any decisions. When and where possible, we believe that the Kubernetes community is filled with people who are tackling challenging and interesting problems every day, and they probably best know how to solve those problems, but oftentimes don't necessarily feel like they have the authority or capability to do that. And so in general, we'd like to give people the mandate to do what it is they think needs to be done to drive this project forward in as open and transparent a way as possible.
Yeah. As a member of the community, I find that the steering committee is a guiding light. If we have challenges or we want to propose a new process, so for example, I'm part of the product SIG, and we're often thinking about new ways after each release and after each retrospective. How can we make the release more transparent? How should we be writing about Kubernetes in our documentation? We can take those proposals to the steering committee, and that's a trusted body that's been elected by the community to give us guidance.
Yeah, I can think of another example is like within the SIGs, I don't think we have a consistent way of how decisions are necessarily made or proposed or escalated. And without that organizational structure, it can be really hard for groups of people to own their areas.
Yeah, as I understand, the SIGs are pretty much independent. They're autonomous, but they're federated as well. And so now you are trying to find ways to structure the organization that allows them to continue to kind of build in the manner that they want to build out their SIG. But the steering committee plays a role, like, for example, I mean, I know that there's considerations, for example, for Containerd and Creo, for example, right? You know, and so there's going to have to be some decision making around that, right? You know, what is it going to, you know, how's the community going to resolve these kinds of issues? That seems the role to me of the steering committee right now.
Yeah, and
or am I wrong? I don't know.
Well, no, I think you're like touching on exactly the sorts of issues that are percolating up to us, and I think like when and where possible, it's useful to keep in mind that the steering committee is currently 13 people who all also seem to have day jobs.
Right.
And so while the community really wants the steering committee to figure out what the best thing is within the community for each certain class of problem, and what's the best way to organize everything, and what's the best way to mandate that SIGs make their decisions, and what's the most effective way to do code of conduct in an open and transparent way, and where should we allocate all of our funding, it's kind of difficult to tackle all of that at once. And so I think, at least me personally, I think the steering committee's biggest mandate is to figure out how to delegate all of that responsibility back to the SIGs. So early in our reception, and even leading up to the steering committee, a lot of people are like, well, we're going to put that problem on hold until the steering committee is around so that they can tackle it. And I think that's really nice and ideal. However, ultimately, what we in the steering committee would appreciate most is for people to sort of propose their solutions to the problem so that we can iterate on something. So I think a great example is, as you talk about cryo and different container runtimes, right? Those all sound like things that, to me, the Node Special Interest Group has a lot of purview over that in sort of deciding how do we make sure that kubelet can support all of these different container runtimes. But I don't necessarily think that we, the steering committee, should have any mandate over which is the best runtime, because the best runtime really depends on the use cases.
Right.
I think another good example is in terms of defining what is Kubernetes. That's something that I would be looking to the architecture special interest group to make that decision sort of out in the open, as opposed to having a core group of 13 people make this decision in secret and then impose it upon the community.
Right.
It's much more informative to have the community kind of come to some rough kind of consensus, and when and where they can't, we can kind of hash that out internally.
I see.
I think that's a really good point about the openness piece. And like in our discussions, we try really hard to document discussions we have, why we're headed towards the decisions we're making, and that sort of stuff. So we're not just coming with here's the decision, but here's how we got here.
Yeah, I think the culture of the SIGs is very, very strong, and a decision like, how do we accommodate a particular runtime, or how do we build, that's a technical decision that would squarely fall in SIG node.
Right.
And then architectural decisions in SIG architecture, these wouldn't necessarily ever reach the steering committee.
Okay, great. So how does it affect kind of, at Google, product development, when you're thinking about the future of Kubernetes and you're thinking about the organization and how it's structured and how you think about your own products?
You mean the steering committee, how does it, or just generally?
I think the steering committee is one way to look at it, but I think we're talking about the future of Kubernetes, and I'm curious about the kind of the culture and the values of the of Kubernetes overall, and that's reflected in the SIGs and it's reflected in the steering committee. And I think then it's like, my question then is, like, if you're thinking about that in the context of your own product development, how do you think about that? How do you think about that?
Well, I think from a Google perspective, we're very much dedicated to the growth of Kubernetes and to helping it thrive. So a project that grows to this size and this level of popularity, it has to be thought through very carefully in terms of the values and the culture.
Right.
And I think from a product perspective, the product SIG in the open source community, which I'm a part of, is a horizontal SIG. And the thing that we try to do is we work with the other SIGs to bring more transparency so that the SIGs know what are they working on that could impact another SIG. And we try and get them to look at dependencies or anything that might not work with each other early in the release process. So that's one thing. As far as, again, what's the direction? That direction is really set by the community. And I think Google plays a part in it as much as to listen, as much as to contribute. So right now, there's a great effort towards stability. And we're contributing, from product to engineering and on all fronts towards stability. And that's a decision that kind of takes place, I think, very well between, all of the different leaders, Brendan Burns, Joe Beda, Tim Hawkin, Brian Grant, everyone that's involved wants this project to succeed and realizes that we have to have a core that's stable in order to make it thrive. And so product as well, supports that.
So we talk about the adolescence, Kubernetes adolescence, and in its maturity. And this seems reflected in what you're talking about, like the overlapping kind of nature of SIGs, and like how you kind of like how you define boundaries and what are the constraints for example in the SIGs, and how does that kind of relate to then the steering committee and kind of the overall culture of the organization. How would you characterize then Kubernetes at this point as an adolescent? What are the challenges that are ahead to bring it into adulthood, I guess, so to speak?
Well, I'm not sure it's the type of project that's like slamming the door and yelling at its parents that they don't understand it, that sort of stuff. But I think, I think you used the magic word there with boundaries. I think there's got to be some boundary testing that happens within the project as we sort of understand, like, really who sort of owns different areas of the project, who like wants to own it, and then who is actually willing to commit to own it and take on the responsibilities that come with it, as well as the empowerment that come with owning different facets of the project. And I think, like, honestly, there's no better way to figure that out than through trial and error. I think if, again, not to hammer on the theme, but if we go back and wait for some sort of grand, unified, crystallized architectural vision that defines exactly where each and every person slots in, you'll be waiting for quite a long time. And I'm a much bigger fan of like delivering value incrementally, whether that be in terms of software or in people or in processes. And so we're super enthusiastic about just trying a couple things out and seeing, like, like as an adolescent generation, like what are the cultural norms that we're going to adopt that other projects haven't necessarily adopted yet, and which ones work for us? What are the trends we're going to buck? So
let me take that adolescent metaphor, since I have a near adolescence, and I can see what's going to happen. So there's actually two keynotes. One keynote tomorrow by Brian Grant talks about what is Kubernetes, and I think that's the existential question that certainly in adolescence, my daughter, I think is going through. It's just like, who am I, right? And when you have this rich community and you're popular, and all of these projects are kind of crowding around you. Who is Kubernetes? What is it? And I would encourage everyone to go to that talk. But that's really where we're defining the core of it and saying, that core is going to be stable. And I think that's part of growing up and maturing, right? So that's a good metaphor. I think the second piece, and this was highlighted in Hen Goldberg's talk this morning, which I think was an amazing keynote, is about extensibility and empowerment. And I think that is something that, as an adolescent, I can tell you that they're looking for. And I think it's essential for this project. And so that extensibility and those 4 or 5 very rich mechanisms for extensibility enable, people to build on top of this really core, stable core.
Yeah, I think there's 2 ways of thinking about the maturity of the project. One is the community and the development processes that we're using, and then the other is in the technology. And I think you both touched on different aspects of that. With the community piece in particular, I think the adolescent metaphor is pretty apt, where it feels like we're kind of lanky and don't really fit into our own body anymore, and like running used to be easy, but now I'm kind of like tripping and falling down. And one thing I think I've observed over the past year is processes that used to be like, okay, you guys are responsible for all the tests for the entire project, making sure they're green, right?
Right.
And then you get to a certain point, and no one group can own that anymore, right? And so then what's the process where we start dividing up responsibility into groups and giving autonomy to different pieces? I see that as the transitional phase we're in now.
This is such a great metaphor.
Give us another one.
Yeah. Yeah, metaphors. Yeah, and I was thinking, like, people don't there's no grand vision for how people grow up, It's not like they become a super adult, right? I'm a little baby. I'm a super adult, right? So that seems interesting. I'm curious from a technology perspective, kind of how we're seeing this maturity emerge. And for example, here at at KubeCon and this event, we're seeing the emergence of service mesh technologies, right? That to me seems a sign of maturity, right? It's like, wait, these pieces are, these pieces are loosely coupled, but gluing them together can be a challenge, for any technologist, right? And so now we're talking about service mesh technologies such as with Istio or Linkerd or their new the Linkerd, the conduit, right, which is new. And that to me seems like a sign of maturity in the technology, at least. Is that a sign for you, or are there other signs in the technology itself that you see reflected in where we are today, especially at this conference?
I'm going to hand
I can take that. Yeah, I think that is definitely a sign of maturity. I think there are other signs as well. Let me start with the other signs, and then I'll come back to this one. So obviously the emergence of standards like CNI and CSI, which is the storage interface, and of course the CRI, the runtime interface. So the emergence of these standards is a sign of maturity. I think the conformance program with the 30 plus or nearly, actually now 40 plus distributions that are conformant, that's a sign of maturity. And then the extensibility mechanisms, the 3 or 4 extensibility mechanisms that Hans spoke about, those are signs of maturity. And in fact, Istio and other service mesh type technologies integrate into Kubernetes through those mechanisms. And the reason that the service broker pieces are a sign of maturity, because it's really now we're moving up the stack, not just about networking and operating systems and container runtimes. That stuff is standardizing, and now we're moving up the stack and thinking about, okay, how do we make sure that the services are authenticated and secured? How do we view the services and troubleshoot them? And that's a sign of maturity because it moves us more towards the developer.
Right. And that then reflects on how the community deals with these kinds of new technologies and how they actually are, and how actually they are developed. The security story is interesting to me too because the security is so different, right? And like how you think about security.
Yeah, I think security and identity, I expect 2018 to be the year of maturing of security and identity in the container and particularly Kubernetes space. We
talked about that yesterday with Brendan and Tim about the container identity issue, right? And how that's going to be more of a topic of discussion. Like, how do you define the identity of a container? It's not necessarily one container as the identity, but it's the identity of the container kind of in a larger perspective. So
I think maybe to go back to your question about the sort of the signs of the maturity, I think you touched on a great point where we've all kind of grokked and understood that the cloud native pattern of deploying applications is kind of a really great way to do it going forward. And we've also kind of accepted that Kubernetes seems to be the de facto way of expressing a lot of these problems in a way that makes sense, which I mean is intuitive to me because Google spent 10 years doing this before they even started sharing this knowledge with the rest of the world through Kubernetes. And I think now we're getting to the point where the rest of the world has accepted as de facto that base starting point, that core, that nucleus that we expect to become boring. And we're talking about patterns like, okay, microservices are given, but how do we actually connect all of them in a great automated way, right? As soon as you start talking about the problem, you understand it so well that you don't just want a human to sit there and maintain it and carefully link all these things together, but you want to express that in a way where automation can take care of it, or you can talk about it as just a general class or pattern of problems. We are, as Aparna said, moving up the stack. I think for better or for worse, the other sign of maturity is that the 3 major cloud providers out there each have their own managed Kubernetes offering, which I think is a good sign that we've acknowledged that there is a real demand out there. And I think it's no longer called Google Container Engine, it's called Google Kubernetes Engine, right?
Okay.
So Kubernetes is the thing that's front and center there. Those are just the biggest marketing sort of
we call it making
signs.
we call it making the K honest.
Yeah, making the K honest. Finally.
It was always GKE, but the K was the container, which is not honest.
Right.
One other sign of maturity, I guess, I've seen recently is instead of having people come talk to me about wanting to expose some new functionality and how can I do this, the conversations are more around that thing you already support, how can I extend it in this way or embed it in this other thing, or introduce my own custom logic around it.
Just like as a small, tiny example of another thing, I think once you see like multiple disparate communities attempt to solve the same problem and kind of coalesce on the same general sort of solution, one thing I've seen recently is how do you describe a Kubernetes cluster as some sort of API object so that you have a good agnostic way of describing what that cluster looks like, but then you could hand that off to your deployment tool or cluster creation tool of choice. And I've seen that idea pop up in cluster lifecycle for those people who want to create the clusters. I've seen that in the multi-cluster special interest group when you talk about how do you manage multiple clusters and talk about which one you want to connect to. And I've seen that crop up in terms of just reporting on clusters. If you have that same sort of consistent model of what a good cluster looks like, that's great. And again, it follows that sign of multiple people are kind of converging on a central common solution. So the more of those we see, the better. And I think we've laid the groundwork for that.
Yeah, I'm going to extend the adolescent analogy one more time to talk about security and identity. You know, I view as Kubernetes becomes a teenager and then an adult is going out into the real world and is getting much more adoption in the enterprise space. And in the enterprise space, security and identity is very, very important. So, you know, the stability that we brought with RBAC and with network policy, that is an enabler for going out into the enterprise. And then the friend that Kubernetes is going to take with it, Istio, is going to provide security at the L7 layer. So, you know, it's going to be much more ready for its debut.
For the big time.
Big time, yeah.
Yeah, the big time. Yeah, that's interesting. I think the other kind of topic I'm interested in is this issue around conformance, right? So you have so much popularity of the Kubernetes, you know, technology that a lot of platforms are emerging around it. You know, I'm trying to think how that reflects on maturity and how that reflects on adolescence and how do you deal with that. I think it's almost like
you finally realize you have to get good grades.
You finally realize you have to get grades, and you finally realize that, hey, you know, there's other people, there's other groups here, there's other technology, you know, there's a lot of different interests. How do, you know, what's my way? I'm curious on how you think of conformance.
Yeah, I think, and I participate in the CNCF as well as one of the members. I think that a lot of projects, open source projects, are starting to look to Kubernetes as an example. Okay, this is how you run an open community, this is how you do testing, this is how, and I mean, it's kind of scary because we're still growing up ourselves, but I think that we're starting to feel like, yeah, you know, we're setting an example.
It's like your younger brother, right, looking up to you when they're like 8, you know, and you're 16 and they think you got it figured out, but you're like, no, man.
Yeah, we're like, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know. The conformance stuff is kind of near and dear to my heart as one of the co-founders of SIG testing. The reason I started that SIG in the first place was because I wanted to help show the rest of the world that Kubernetes worked in all of the different places. Like, part of the initial selling points I thought for Kubernetes was this is truly kind of the like run once, run anywhere sort of paradigm. If you can, just as long as you can run it on a Kubernetes cluster, anywhere Kubernetes cluster runs, it'll work. But then all the automated testing that we had to begin with was mostly Google-based, even though I knew that it worked on AWS, because Samsung really recognized that we needed to prove to larger enterprisey customers that, for better or for worse, they thought that AWS was, you know, the cloud that nobody got fired for buying, just like nobody got fired for buying IBM. And so, you know, through SIG testing, we helped improve the coverage and frequency and automation of testing on AWS. And I think I'm really excited to see this conformance effort move forward where, you know, you can just sort of go look at a page and see here are all the distributions and here are all sort of the levels of conformance that they have. I know there are efforts to move conformance beyond just the, yeah, it supports the 80 plus or the 120 tests or so that cover these, you know, 50 or so APIs to this is the distribution that's conformant when we talk about performance profiles and meeting, you know, latencies and thresholds. This is the distribution that's conformant as far as supporting high performance networking or storage or embedded distributions. And I'm really excited to see that move forward in an open and transparent way where the community is empowered to submit data that proves their stuff is awesome. There's no like central gatekeeper other than the quality of the code and the results that it generates. So yeah, it's super cool.
I think, I would love to kind of continue this conversation. We got to come to a close, but the other part of it that I'm really thinking about too is just like the growing community itself, right? As the number of contributors increase, right, it's going to become that more complex to manage overall. And that seems to me like another topic for another day, but that seems like the big issue coming forward as well.
I will just tie back real quick. So, and you said the sort of the values of Kubernetes is something that Sarah Novotny is going to cover in her keynote tomorrow.
Yeah.
It was something that sort of the Bootstrap steering committee tried to rattle off, but we decided that was outside of the initial scope of our charter.
Right.
And the steering committee recognizes that the growth and health of the community is like priority number one in order to continue to keep this a healthy project. Contributor experience is sort of the special interest groups that is actively working on that, and I believe we're going to hear about some sort of mentorship programs to really help tackle this.
That seems like it will be needed.
Yeah, we're piloting a mentorship program, and that is, as Aaron said, like very important to us. We're putting a lot of thought into it, and it's not just about adding new contributors, but also about growing the leadership of the existing contributors that we have into more mature roles.
Yeah, I'm bullish on the sustainability of the project. I think aside from engineering, also having a large number of users who are then also contributing back to the project, I think that keeps it healthy. And then a number of different vendors that have built businesses around the project, that keeps it healthy. I mean, there are always conflicts and challenges as well, but I think that we're putting in place the structure and the culture that's going to sustain it.
Well, thank you all for joining the New Stack for a conversation about the future of Kubernetes, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time, Alex.
Thanks.